Hi, I'm George Woodbury from College of the Sequoias in Visalia, California, and in this video we're going to go over powers of I. And we're going to build a pattern that you can use to simplify powers of I that are 2 or higher. We're going to start with building a table. Obviously we know that I to the first power is just I. And we also have a formula, a rule for I squared. We know that I squared by definition is -1. Now, I to the third power, I can get by multiplying I squared times I. But I know that that's -1 times I, or simply -I. I to the fourth power, I can think of that as I squared times I squared, or -1 times -1, and that's equal to +1. So for the first 4 powers of I, we've gotten 4 different answers, but this is where the pattern starts to repeat. I to the 5th power is really just I to the 4th power times I. And I to the 4th power is 1. So 1 times I is I. I to the 6th power, we can think of as I to the 4th times I squared. And I to the 4th is equal to 1. So multiplying by 1 doesn't change anything. We're left with I squared or -1. And we're going to see that pattern continue. I to the 7th power is really the same as I to the 3rd power or -I. I to the 8th power is really the same as I to the 4th power or 1. And so what I want you to think about is taking the power that you have, rewriting it as the product of 2 powers of I, one that's a multiple of 4 and one that's the leftover for that, and that'll help us to figure out. The real pattern that you want to remember is over here, although I to the 4th, you can also think of that as I to the 0 power equals 1. So I to the 18th power, the biggest multiple of 4 that goes into 18 is 16. Right? 4 times 4 is 16 with 2 left over. So I can first think of this as I to the 16th power times I squared. And I to the 16th power is just a fancy way to write 1. I squared, we know by definition that's -1. And so we get -1. I squared from my table, I had that listed as -1 as well. I to the 33rd power, the multiple of 4 that comes closest to 33 without going over is 32. So this can be I to the 32nd power times I to the 1st. That multiple of 4, that power that's the multiple of 4, that factor just becomes 1. So what we're really going to have left is I to the 1st power, or I. I to the 44th power, that is a multiple of 4. If you divide 4 into 44 by hand, there's no remainder. When that's the case, if 4 goes into that power evenly, this is the same as I to the 0 power, or 1. 47, I to the 47th power, this is the same as I to the 44th times I to the 3rd. I to the 44th power, that exponent is a multiple of 4. That's going to become 1 through our cycle. So I'm left with I cubed. Now, if I don't remember what that is from my table, I can really just rewrite this as I times I times I. And I know that I squared, the first 2 factors of I, that's -1. So I've got -1 times I, or -I. Okay. That is how you simplify powers of I.